start out with a little intro, and of course you guys know quite a bit about the farm, but just to review Millsap Farm by the numbers. Okay, so we have 20 acres of land. Where we're standing right now is basically halfway. It's 2 squares, it's a big rectangle, and so we're about halfway north to south on the land. On that 20 acres, we grow 2.5 acres of vegetables, so that's basically our tilled space. I mean, although tilled may not even be the right word anymore because we're doing less and less of that, but it is, our growing space is about 2.5 acres. Within that, then we've got a 6,000 square foot greenhouse. That's the big structural greenhouse up front. It's 45 years old now. It's not a young greenhouse. I was just reflecting the other day, it's just not quite old enough to be glass, which is unfortunate. It would have been really cool if it had been glass, but it's not. And then we have about 20,000 square feet of other coverage space, actually a little more than that. And we're going to visit all those spaces, or at least we'll visit some of those spaces today. In the summertime, we have between 175 and 245 CSA members, and that's our main market. I say that's a pretty wide range, I realize, but that's because COVID just blew the lid off demand this year, and so we went from 175 members being kind of our standard number to sold 145 shares and didn't really do any promotion. Probably could have sold more, but that was enough. And in the wintertime, so historically, meaning like before the last 2 or 3 years, I guess, we used to do a 50-member CSA in the wintertime, and then we have moved to doing a larger fall share. And so now we do a share from basically the end of October to Christmas time. And we'll get into a little bit about why we do that, but the essence of it is just that it's easier on us, both in terms of lifestyle and in terms of production. It was much easier to hit that target and hit it big than it is to like make sure you've got produce in January, February, March on a consistent basis. And just to give you an idea of what winter production looks like, right now we are doing somewhere between $1,000 and $1,500 a week on winter sales. That's really not, I mean, that's less than 1/10 of what we do in the summertime. But it's, you know, it is cash that makes a difference, and so that it's still worth doing. Obviously, it's not, I don't think you could, there are people who have said, what if we just grew in the wintertime and didn't grow in the summer? And that's a cool idea, but I don't really think it works. And the reason I don't think it works is because the natural resource that we use more than anything else is sunlight. And there's a lot less of it this time of year. You can compensate for temperature, but you really can't, I mean, it's much more complicated to do extra light. People do it, but it's a lot more expense, it's a lot more energy use, and I don't really see the advantage there. So anyway, so we do winter as a sort of a supplement, but we've always done it. So we've been farming 14 years now, and every year we did winter growing. We got started with Elliot Coleman, and you know, right away he talks about how important it is to have year-round income, and how not just that, but we want to feed people year-round. You know, as we got started on the farm, we realized like people eat 365 days a year. We probably should try and sell food to them for 365 days a year if we want to be sort of their food source. And that's worked out pretty well for us overall. So, so any questions? So the metal structure was in good shape. And I don't really know what it is. It's probably, we think it was a Canadian-made rolled steel structure probably, but I can't find any information on that. And so the steel structure itself is in good shape, was in good shape, had a few broken bolts and nuts in here and there, but it was pretty easily fixed. The plastic had been off of it for about 7 years or so. So everything inside of it was just kind of needed to be scraped back to the concrete and dirt and started over. So it did take us a significant amount of time to renovate that. And but that said, I mean, you know, looking at a similar greenhouse, 6,000 square foot greenhouse, you would very likely be into, I mean, the typical ballpark number for something like that is $20 a square foot. So that's 120,000, right? Yeah, that's a lot of money. So, you know, this is definitely was a good investment for us. Interesting thing about that, and something to think about as you think about your own future plans. Greenhouses are one of those things that they don't have a lot of use or value as a used structure, in the sense that like nobody goes out and seeks out used greenhouses to buy them and move them or necessarily to buy them and use them in place, because moving them is a big hassle, and using them in place requires that you relocate your farm, if you're already farming. And so the really cool thing from a buyer perspective then, if you're looking at becoming a new farmer, is those basically don't have any value when you go to sell the place. Now, convincing people of that can be a challenge, but most sellers recognize, at some point they recognize like, oh yeah, I'm not going to get my money out of my greenhouses. There's no way, because you have to have a buyer who wants that. You have to have a buyer who also wants all the other things on your property, and so on. And so in our case, we really paid for the house and the land and the shop building and the greenhouse and even all the water infrastructure and all other things that he had put in place over the years, because it was a nursery for about 45 years, or it was about, I guess it was about 30 years before I bought it. So all that infrastructure was basically a freebie, if you will. Oh, that was a really good deal for me. So, yeah, good question. Yeah, so the difference between winter and summer greenhouse use, and I'd really even break it out into maybe finer than that in terms of, so this is we were starting to get now into our real seed starting season, right? And so for that part of the year, we maintain the greenhouse at temperatures and ventilation levels to support the growth of baby seedlings, right? Warmer weather stuff by now, because we're starting to see tomatoes pop and peppers and things like that on the seedling table. And so that means we've got to jack our temperatures up. So from now until, say, the end of March, we'll be on a pretty aggressive heating schedule, which means a lot of firewood going into the furnaces and a fair bit of propane going into the seedling table heat and the propane furnace, because we'd like to keep a nighttime temperature above 45. We'd really like to keep it above 55, but there's only so many times I want to get up in the night and feed the fire, right? Yeah. It's a lot of fuel. Yeah, and people who run big greenhouses at kind of that kind of the magic temperature if you want to do tomato production is 60 degrees. If you drop below 60, you start dropping blossoms. So if you're running a greenhouse like that, then you're into $100 worth of propane a night pretty easily. And that means by the time you get your first tomato, you've got $10,000 sunk into propane. So, and that's a really interesting point, and we'll kind of come back around to it, but that's not the type of winter production we do. We do minimal heat, minimal energy use, where we go, okay, well, where can we strategically apply a little bit of extra juice, heat and propane or wood or whatever it is, to get the maximum return for it, instead of aiming to produce summer vegetables in the winter. So, but from now until, until the end of March is our heavy heating season, and that's really to get our seedlings off to a good start, but then we also use it to our advantage for the rest of the space, which we don't use entirely for seedlings, to grow lots of things like fennel and head lettuce and herbs and a lot of cut flowers, a lot of other high value crops that we can crank out a lot of volume in a hurry. But then after that, that time frame really kind of then seedling season continues until the end of May or so. And around that time, we start changing to more of a summer production model, where we've got tomatoes and cucumbers and things in the beds that are really, and of course we don't have to heat at that point, we just have to ventilate plenty. And so all that is kind of mellows the greenhouse out in a way. It becomes a less intense energy use and less of a hassle for us to manage. And then somewhere along the line, then we also have get back into seedling. We never totally get out of seedling production because we do so much transplanting, but it becomes less of a focus, and we kind of back up and start doing more of the seedlings in the fall when we're getting ready to start stuff back out into the field. So yeah, you're right. It's a flexible space, and one thing I love about greenhouses is they have a place year-round. You can use them for all sorts of different things. It always amazes me, and a lot of these big commercial greenhouses, if you look, are only used from now until Mother's Day, basically, and after that they're done. And they close the place up, and they spray it out, clean it up, dry it out, and lock it up and ignore it until the next January, which is amazing. Like that's an interesting economic model. It works for them. They make a ton of money in that time period. They put a whole lot of time, energy, and labor into it. But it seems to me like not the optimal use of resources. It seems like you could go back in there and now do something different for the next, 7 months before you start back in. So, but again, not my business. I don't really care, but I used to look at those and think there's got to be a way that a farmer could sort of step in and say, can I use your greenhouse in the 7 months you're not using it? But I don't know what that would be. So I wanted to talk about planning, because really that's as much of it as anything else is the plan. If you don't have a good plan, then what do they say? A failure to plan is a plan to fail. And so that's definitely true in farming. So in planning, we have 3 big elements that we got to consider: schedules, varieties, and marketing. And you guys have on the back of this, there's a really cool, really cool, I don't know if it is or not, but there's a couple of spreadsheets at the back here, and I'll kind of just walk you through them real quick. But these are, some of them are, one of them is a spreadsheet that I have that we made, and then a couple of them are spreadsheets from Michigan State, which has a student organic farm, which always throws me when I hear MSU has a big student organic farm. I'm like, really? Oh, Michigan, right? Yeah. So one day MSU, you'll do it too. But anyway, this spreadsheet has those elements, right? So that if you look at that first one, it says hoop house, cultivar, and scheduling examples. There are what we're growing is on the left. How we're growing it is there in the middle. When we're growing it is there, and then and he doesn't have harvest date on here, but he does link that in the next spreadsheet, which is about income, and he's saying, when are we going to be able to harvest these things based on oh yeah, and again, he doesn't really have the harvest date on these, but he has projected income. Okay, so it's a similar system. What are you growing? When are you planting it? How much of it are you planting? And then in this case, he's looking more at income and saying, how much will we earn out of this bed? And so this is one version of a plan. You can see his elements are there. They're pretty straightforward, but they are a little different than what I use, which is the next page. And this is really, we don't have really any income projections on here. This is all about tracking our plantings and transplanting and varieties. So, and this is actually has shrunk quite a bit. There's another 10 rows or so of this spreadsheet, but this gets, or columns I mean, but this will get you an idea. So we got what are we growing on the left, how many row feet, what's that spacing going to look like? So for example, the tomatoes, early girl tomatoes, we're going to do 100 row feet. We're going to put them on 24-inch spacing. That means we're going to need 50 plants, right? Number of seedlings, that means we're going to anticipate that we're going to lose some in the greenhouse. We're going to have some loss that way. And our loss number, this is actually an older version of the spreadsheet. You can see it's from 2011. We've reduced our loss number because we've gotten better at growing seedlings, but we used to figure on a 50%. And we also figured, well, we can sell extra seedlings and whatever, and that's true. You're much better off having extra seedlings and composting them than having extra space in the garden and not growing food. So it's always better a good investment to have extra seedlings. How many rows in the bed? In the case of tomatoes, it's 1, but you can look down the row there and see, kale has 3 rows in a bed and so on. And then how many beds? And our beds are based on 100 feet. That's our standard row size. And the nice thing about having beds in there is it's just a little easier to visualize. And you say, oh, we need 1 bed of tomatoes. Okay, I understand what that means. If you say, now with these it's easier, but if you say 200 row feet of kale, well then I got to think through, okay, so 3 rows. Well, oh yeah, it's 2/3 of a bed of kale, that's what I need. So when are we going to plant it? Oh, sorry, flat size is, in this case it's soil blocks, so that's a 2-inch soil block for those tomatoes. And then the plant date is when we're going to start that seed in the greenhouse. So that's the 9th of January. And then how long will that seedling need to mature before we transplant it out? It'll be 65 days that we expect it to mature, and then we'll transplant it out on the 15th of March. And don't worry about the TPW, but that's week of the growing season. That's weeks before CSA, so it's 4 weeks before the CSA starts. And days to maturity. it's a 76-day maturity, and that means that the 30th of May is when we expect to harvest those tomatoes. Now, we've looked at it that way, but let me tell you that the way we actually think about it is we start from harvest. We say we'd like to have tomatoes the last week of May. What will we have to do to make that happen? We put that date in, and our spreadsheet, because of the formulas we put into it, backs that up and gives us all these other dates. And that's super helpful, because really what you want to know is, when am I going to have tomatoes? You know, you want to be able to plan for that, and on down the line. And then of course sometimes you look at that and you say, you know, I'd like to have tomatoes the 1st of May. Oh Lord, that means transplanting the tomatoes the 15th of February. That's not going to work. I can't do that. So you have to balance the thing you would like with the realities of your growing situation. But that's how this works for us. And it's a really, on one hand, it's really simple, but on the other hand, you know, there's a lot of information here. And what it does then is, because we start with this plan, when we get into the growing season, we don't have to think it through. We're not getting to the, you know, the 3rd week of May, which is one of the busiest weeks of our year, because we've got all this stuff being transplanted, and we got this stuff being harvested, and we got CSA starting up. And you know, the last thing I need to do that week is go like, now what do we need to plant this week? Like, no, that's not the time to do that. December is a lovely time to be thinking about that. May is the time to just go, oh yeah, we got to get these lettuces in. Let's drop seeds in the lettuce blocks before we move on with the rest of our day. So that is part of the value of a plan. And then the other part is being able to predict for marketing what you're going to have, right? So in our case with the CSA, we want to make sure to have a consistent, abundant supply of vegetables. It will not do my CSA members any good at all if I have a bushel of tomatoes for them the 1st of July, but the rest, you know, up until then I don't have anything. They will not be thrilled with me about that. They would like to have tomatoes as early as is kind of reasonably possible, and then a steady supply. And they really don't ever want a bushel of tomatoes. Most of my members never want to get a bushel of tomatoes from me. That would not make them happy. So I want to plan accordingly. And so if you look there, you'll see key elements of the plan. Well, we got to have varieties, amounts, dates, and harvest dates. So all that stuff is, you know, if you're just building a basic schedule, that's all there is to it. A friend of mine uses a poster board. At the beginning of in the winter, he takes a big sheet of poster board and he makes a grid, draws it with Sharpie, you know, and then he starts at the top and he says, this bed, you know, bed, we'll call it 1A, right? Bed 1A. And then that is the horizontal axis, and the vertical axis is weeks of the year. And so 1A, 1st week of January, he's going to spread compost, let's say. And then he's going to have 6 weeks where he really doesn't do anything in that bed. And then he's on week 8 of the year, because, you know, 1 + 7 is week 8 of the year. Now he's going to transplant onions. And he's going to mark that in that little box. And he's, you know, a little bitty box, but all he has to do is say onions. And he knows, time to put the onions in that bed. And then 6 weeks after that, he's going to say, begin harvest. And then he's going to mark for, you know, 4 weeks or 6 weeks or however long he expects those onions to be harvested. He's going to mark H for harvest. And then he's going to mark the next crop or the next step in that bed. It's dead simple. He's certified organic. It's worked to get certification, which means that it's kind of in terms of documentation, it's the gold standard. If you can get certified organic, you're doing a really good job of documenting. All done on a big sheet of poster board once a year. So it doesn't have to be a spreadsheet. You don't have to be a computer person to make this work. It can be as simple or as complex as you want to make it. The key is to have one. Failure to plan is a plan to fail. So make sure that when you start gardening, whether it's summer or winter, you have a good plan. So let's stretch our legs out a little bit because we're standing here a while. What we're going to talk about as we go is day length, and we'll look at a couple different examples of crops and when we've planted them and how long it's taking them to mature. Anything that is going to be seeded and then transplanted more than 4 weeks later, we are probably going to pot up. Yeah, so we, on those tomatoes, we start with a little soil block, you know, so it's only a 2-inch by 2-inch soil block. And when we transplant them into the field, we're usually putting them out in 3 or 4-inch pots, depending on how much time has elapsed. And we find that pays off. Having a big plant really makes a difference. Now in the spring, when we get into like our June plantings of tomatoes, the last round of tomatoes, we don't do that. We don't pot those up. We just let them, because at that point the soil's so warm, we're better off just sticking that soil block into the soil. So then I transplant that out as that small baby, exactly. But it'll grow so fast at that point it doesn't matter. You know, how much of a margin of error do you need to insert, right? When you start planning for seeding. We do this, we think of 3 things when we do that. One is, how cheap's the seed? You know, if it's cheap seed, then I'm gonna overseed it. 2, how important is that crop to me? So if it's head lettuce, you know, each plant represents a couple dollars of profit. If I don't have quite as much head lettuce as I'd like, that's not too big a deal. So I will be less likely to heavily overseed head lettuce, you know, because also the numbers in head lettuce are going to be a lot bigger. So I maybe, you know, maybe our seed plan would often be for like 600 heads of lettuce. Well, I'm not going to put 900 heads of lettuce in my seedling plan just to be able to have 600. That seems sort of ridiculous because they're only worth a couple bucks a piece. But if I'm doing a tomato plant and I know I'm going to put that tomato plant into a greenhouse and it's going to be there the entire season. I mean, this is an 8-month production cycle, so I'm looking at, you know, hopefully $50 to $60 worth of tomatoes off of that plant. Now I'm going to make sure I have that plant. So those actually, and that's one of those places where the expensive seed thing kind of flips on itself, where you're like, well, yeah, but I mean, those $1 a seed tomato plants, I need to seed a few extra of those, so I make sure I have enough of those. And then the other thing that we do think through as well is, do we have a habit of losing these plants? So for example, our fall brassicas are a really good example where we have historically had pretty high death rates in those plants. So we overseed those by quite a bit. Whereas our spring tomatoes, we started with a 50% overage and we're down to less than 20% now on our plan because we take really good care of them. We have a good system now with bottom heat and overhead watering and germination chamber where, you know, our success rate is usually 90 plus on the seeds that we plant. So yeah, so some of it's experience, but a lot of it is measuring those things and thinking those through. Like, oh, and I guess the other thing that kind of along the lines of how important is it to me, how replaceable is it? So on the plus side, if it's a big slicer tomato, well, if I need to, I can probably find other farmers I can buy some extra tomato seedlings from. If it's a greenhouse cucumber, there's no way. There's nobody here who I'm going to be able to buy greenhouse cucumbers from, or even eggplant. I mean, some of those kind of oddities that other people just don't grow very much of, my odds of being able to find plants for those are pretty poor. So I'll make sure that I have my own seedlings. Cherry tomatoes are another one. There are several varieties of cherry tomatoes we use that are really good, and I wouldn't want to be without those for a summer, and so I make sure to seed a little extra on those. It's pretty much his crop planting system. Yeah, I mean, but he's been doing it for 25 years, you know, so for him to say, oh, 1 bed of onions, yeah, that's enough to get me through a season. Like it's just that easy for him because he's done it for so long. I don't think we're there, but we're closer to that than we were certainly 14 years ago. I mean, to put specifics on that, over the years, it used to be like, golly, like a 7-day process for me to build the crop plan each year and review and figure out what worked and didn't and the numbers and, you know, all that stuff. And this year, Kimby and I spent a day on it. And even that, we were like, man, we don't need to change much. Most of what we did worked. We piddled with a few different varieties. We moved a few dates here and there. We're doing more seedling table heat than we used to, so our tomatoes are growing faster, so we pushed them back a week on seeding, that kind of stuff. But it's really, at this point, it's just like fine-tune dialing rather than, it used to be like, take this thing apart. We got to dig into it. We got to find out, you know, what's going on down deep. And now it's really not that for the most part. So I have a great mnemonic for you. You need to keep a page in your notebook or a page in your phone that is painful things to remember in November. And it's that reminder that, like, no matter how good your season went, there were a couple things that and you should not forget those, because what will happen is, like, in July, you're like, oh, I will never forget this. But by the time November rolls around, you're like, oh, it's over. I'm going to hibernate now. And but you need to have that category somewhere that says, I'm going to revisit these. And some of them are things that we want to remember because they were painful lessons. Other things are like, oh, that would be cool to try, and I want to jot it down in the moment. But I have a whole category called, things to remember in November. A couple years ago, we figured out that we wanted to grow peas. We tried 3 different varieties of peas. And of course, peas are a pretty early crop, and we're going to plant them in March, and then we're going to be done with them by the end of May or the beginning of June. And so the span between that and the end of the year, when I'm like trying to remember which peas did we like, is forever. So we now know Sugar Ann, but the only way we know Sugar Ann is because in May, when I was picking peas, I went, oh wow, these Sugar Anns are clearly superior to these Sugar Snaps, to these whatever, and so we jotted that down. Painful things to remember, would fall in the category of like using fresh compost on your brassicas. Don't do that. That's a bad idea. You won't have brassicas. So I definitely have written many notes to myself over the years. And a lot of times there'll be notes from other growers too. Go visit a farm and you go, oh wow, I really like that. That's a great idea. But it's something I have to implement over the winter. And so that goes on that list as well. Oh, why not put fresh compost on our brassicas? Well, 2 things. One, fresh compost tends to attract cabbage root maggots, which are little flies. So if you think about it in terms of, is this compost have some smell? If you can smell the compost, so can the flies, and they're going to come and lay their eggs there, and then those little maggots go into the compost and actually eat the roots of the crop. So that's a problem. And we didn't understand why that was happening, but we had like the turnips would just be gnarly. They had little trails eaten all over the sides of them, and it's somewhere along the line I either listened to a podcast or something, but it was middle of the summer, and I remember going, oh, that's why those look that way. So that's part of it. And the other part is they don't do a good job of utilizing those fresh nutrients. They really need a little more established bed. So if you do have to use the compost that's a little less finished than you'd like, then you really need to till it into the soil so that it at least balances some. Because if your soil is mixed with compost, it's more forgiving than if you're just basically planting into compost. Now, what I've seen is the city compost, so what we like to do if we're getting the city stuff is we like to get it in advance. Like we like to order it now and let it sit until we use it. And oftentimes that'll be 3 or 4 months. And it does a lot of finishing in that time. I mean, it pretty much always, any compost you order, when it comes off the truck, it's going to be hot because that's just their cycle. Like it doesn't pay them to let the stuff sit around for 6 months and cool off. And that's fine. But as long as we know that, then we don't have unreasonable expectations of how finished that compost is going to be. And that lasts, 3 to 6 months, depending on the conditions and temperatures. It really makes a huge difference in how that compost interacts with our plants. And if it's still steaming, the plants really aren't going to appreciate it that much. And if it's, so which is why, as we've prepped for fall, and you guys have helped me do that, so much of our work has been spreading compost and getting amendments in the ground now for the spring. Because we've just found that the sooner we do that work, the better our results. So, which is also sometimes frustrating because, we're still harvesting and doing all fall, we've still got lots of harvest work to do. So it feels like, well, couldn't this wait until February when we really don't have that much going on? And yeah, you can, but it's really better if you get it done sooner because then it sits there and kind of mellows out over the winter. So. Okay, so in here, we won't belabor it, but over on our right, we've got some spinach that went in the ground a little bit later than we would have liked, about 3 weeks later than we would have liked. And on the left, we've got cabbages that did the same, Napa cabbage. So the spinach that we'll see in the fig house was planted 3 to 4 weeks before this, and the Napa cabbage in the fig house has actually already been harvested out. It was the same deal. And I'll let you guys step up and take a peek in there if you want. But the difference, so Napa cabbage should take 6-ish weeks to go from transplant to maturity in the regular season. But this time of year, we're down to fewer growing degrees, right? So it's just getting colder, and we don't have as many hours of the day when the photosynthesis is happening, and we also have a lot less light. So as you think about your plan for winter growing, you really have to take that into account. Let's contrast that with spring. In the springtime, if you get something in the 15th of March or the 1st of April, 2-week gap, a lot of times they'll catch up with each other. Heads of lettuce planted at those 2 different dates, you may harvest them 3 or 4 days apart. Because you're getting warmer, your days are getting longer, so things are accelerating, right? This is the opposite. Things are decelerating. So if you miss your plant date by a couple weeks, you may be not harvesting. I mean, in the case of that spinach, we have yet to harvest off of it because it's just not gonna, I mean, eventually it will come back around. This is the time of year when things start to get a little more sunshine, so it's starting to grow better. But it was kind of a bummer because had we had it in there 3 weeks before, we would have harvested it for Christmas. So to be real specific, head lettuce that we plant in December will take sometimes as long as 12 weeks to mature, versus head lettuce planted in September will take 4 weeks to mature. So between those two times, you lose all that production, or I guess you have to plan for all that extra time. So I wish I could give you a magic number to plug in and say, oh, well, now we're going to hit it. It doesn't really work that way, and even year to year, it can be kind of vague because if we get a warm September, October, then things will grow fast, and they'll really sometimes be almost too mature by the time we get into October or November. And then other years, we get a cloudy, cool October, it starts getting cold in October, and things really slow down early. So it's hard to predict, but the safe thing to say is you need a lot more time in the fall to mature a crop than you do in the spring. And so in general, if we're planting anything after the middle of September, we're going to start by adding 2 weeks to maturity, and then the later we get, we're going to add more and more time to that. And so there are some good there's some good calculators in the Hoop House Handbook by Pam Dowling is one of the most detailed. Well, Pam in general has just such a real detailed approach to the way she grows. She's been growing for 35 years, so she's got a lot of history, and she's kept really good documentation. So she can tell you, in a very similar climate to ours, she's coastal Virginia, so it's a little warmer, but it's the same latitude. She can say, these are the dates we have to hit if we want to harvest then. And so that's a really good, useful resource. Because in the spring, it's very forgiving. In the fall, it's the opposite. It's you hit the dates or you're not going to harvest. So that was dates. What else? Seedling dates, and I said that's influenced by day length and then temperatures, of course. Other things you got to think about: when's your first frost date? So around here, first potential frost is the 1st of October. Average first frost is October 15th. So sometime between the 1st and the 15th, we will usually get a frost. Sometimes it'll be later. But that's, of course, going to end the cropping cycle for a lot of stuff. So you got to be ready for that. When do you want to harvest? That's really the key thing in any crop plan is when do I want to be able to harvest this stuff? Because that's what it's all got to back up off of that, right? And then one of the things we run into a lot in fall growing is where are we going to put this stuff? Where's our space? So you got to be thinking back in July as crops start coming out of the field, the onion field clears out. Well, what's going to go in here next, and how much space am I going to have? And if I want to plant carrots in the fall onion beds, then I need to get those prepped and ready so that when carrot planting comes around in the 1st of August, I've got a bed that's ready to go. So having space in the plan is part of it. And then labor, because again, it's the middle of summer, you're busy harvesting, you got all these other things happening. You've got to make sure that your plan is realistic about how much stuff you can get done, because well, the days are long in July, but they're not infinite. You still have 24 hours, right? So got to make sure that works. And then fertility is something to consider, because depending on what you've grown that spring, you may or may not have a lot of nitrogen, for example, left in the field, or you may need to do some soil work to get that back to a texture that you're happy with, or whatever that is. But all that stuff needs to be part of the plan, because otherwise, like we say, if you don't think about that, then you'll show up at the planting date and be like, oh crap, the carrot beds are still weedy and I haven't put any compost on top of them and I haven't tarped them for a month and I'm not ready to plant carrots. And then you probably you probably shouldn't try at that point. Like, if you get to that point and it's the day to plant and you're that far behind, it might be better to cover crop it that year, rather than deal with a weedy bed of carrots they'll never produce. So, and I want to take you guys up and show you the storage crops, and we'll talk about the difference between storage and fresh harvest. Any questions about that scheduling piece or those considerations? The question is, how much of this, how much rotation and amendments and soil work do we reflect in basically our crop plan? And the answer is this part of the crop plan, the spreadsheet, almost zero. We do have, I don't think it's on this version, it's one of those missing rows, but we do have blocks. So it'll say, these tomatoes are going in block A or block C or whatever it is. So we have that much of it, so at least we know where we're putting those plants. But beyond that, it's actually a separate piece that we have. Our rotation and fertility plan and that kind of stuff is actually on a different, I'd call it a different piece of work. So, but yeah, and we won't get into that too much today, but it is, because it's this whole other thing. But it's something I'd be glad we could definitely do a lesson on one day, because I think it's huge. Yeah, the one thing I will say on that, and I think it's wise. I think it's in the J.M. Fortier book, but he says, oh, there's all this really important stuff you need to know about rotation and crops, most about rotation and planting your fields and so on. He says, but ignore that for your first couple years, because really, that is not the thing to focus. Because you can get really bound up in this stuff. I mean, it's pretty complex, and when you start really trying to put together a plan that adequately spaces the alliums apart from each other in time over a space of years, you don't know enough when you start your farm to really do that well. And so we tried our first couple years to make plans like that, and then realized okay, yeah, we just need to get everything in the ground, and then as we get better at doing that, we'll move to the next level, which is to say, and now we'd like to make them dance, But first you got to get everybody to show up. So getting the crops in the ground trumps the idea of rotation initially. But that said, I've got some good pieces I'm glad to share about how we do that and how we make that work. So yeah, I share this real freely. It was shared freely with me. I'm glad to share it on. I should give credit where credit is due. Tom Ruggieri of Fair Share Farms taught a CSA class. He and his wife Rebecca taught a CSA class years and years ago that totally saved our bacon in year 2 of our CSA. And this was part of it, this spreadsheet, and was like, oh, that's how you do this, because we've been doing paper plans and.
It has something similar, but I still just want to see it.
Absolutely, and it's a Google Doc. It's super easy for me to send you a link. So, yeah. What you notice is we've got 3 coolers now, cooler 1, 2, 3, and they've each got different conditions. So cooler 1 and cooler 2 are similar in temperature. They're both in the low 30s. Cooler number 1 is our sort of short-term storage, where we put things in there that are basically going to go in and out in a week. And cooler number 2 is our long-term storage, where we're going to put carrots, turnips, beets, potatoes, anything that wants to stay cold and pretty dry. But well, that's actually one of those kind of balance points where, carrots would like to be wet. Some other crops would not like to be so wet, but so we don't always have perfect conditions that way. We can usually adjust that by keeping closed totes or open totes or perforated bags or whatever. But as you look at your list here, when I talk about planning, there's a lot of crops that when we think of winter sales, we're really thinking about growing them in the summer for storage. So carrots, sweet potatoes, white potatoes, beets, turnips, garlic, onions, apples, winter squash, cabbage, kohlrabi, and winter radishes. So all those are things that we can grow in the summer, harvest in the fall, and then stick into the cooler. Now the sweet potatoes and winter squash, those are going to go into our 3rd cooler, which is our 55-degree cooler, and they will hold in there really well. We actually have sold out almost all of our winter squash and sweet potatoes this year, but in years past we still had 800 to 900 pounds of sweet potatoes and winter squash in our warmer cooler at this point. And then one thing we played around with this year was we did citrus as well. We got bins of citrus from South Texas, and we're able to keep them in there, and that was pretty awesome. I mean, if nothing else, I gorged on grapefruit for 2 months. It was the best 2 months of November, December ever, because every time I wanted a grapefruit, I ate one, which is a lot. It turns out, a lot of grapefruit. So anyway, so then as we look at our list, we say, okay, so there's these things on this category on the left that are storage crops, but then there's also the things on the right that are fresh harvest, and there's some overlap. So carrots and beets can be either one. Turnips can be either one. Scallions to some degree can be either one. I mean, they're not long-term storage crop, but they can sit in there for 4 weeks and still be okay. So, so as we think that through, it's kind of, it's interesting to notice that there are some crops that we could kind of use either way. And so it used to be that we would kind of squirrel crops away and sort of save them. And I've realized that's a bad idea. If somebody wants to buy something, you should sell it to them. Because if it sits in your cooler, it's not gaining value. It's not like a fine wine. Like, the carrots aren't worth more in 3 months than they were the day you harvested them. And so we do less of that now, which is also part of why the coolers are probably less full than they have been in the past. Because with the demand up the way it has been, we just said, yeah, we'll sell it to you. You bet. So, but anyway, let's just take, you know, a couple at a time or something. Take a look in cooler 2 in particular and cooler 3, either one or both, and just kind of get an idea. You know, criteria for storage is making sure the temperatures are right, the moisture's right, and you can keep rodents out. Those are the kind of the big 3 of storage. So if you don't do those 3 things, then you will have huge losses, and that's pretty disheartening. So part of keeping things really cold is it slows down ethylene release, and the problem is that ripe fruit produces ethylene, and ethylene then causes maturity of other things as well. So, I mean, you know how if you've got unripe bananas, you put them in the bowl with the apple, you have ripe bananas in like several hours. It's kind of astonishing. But sometimes we'll get an ethylene filter and put it in there, and it's these little kind of, I think they're like little clay pellet sort of things, but they absorb ethylene, and they'll absorb quite a bit. And so you put those in front of your fan in your cooler, and it does help. It doesn't stop it, but it slows it down. So. So we always label what what's going in the cooler with when we have a destination, where it's going. So if it's going to be CSA or farmers market or whatever, we'll mark that, and how much of it is there. Follow me. Let's see, we'll step over here to the seedling table. I brought you in here to show you the seedlings, but what we're really talking about is levels of frost hardiness. So on your handout here you see this kind of the contrast, and I was pointing out that variety selection matters. So when we look at this fresh harvest list, carrots, lettuce, kale, green onions, well, those are great because they are cold hardy to some degree or another. But what you also got to realize is they are varying degrees of cold hardy. So here we've got this chart with the levels, different levels of frost tolerance, and obviously, or maybe it's not always obvious, there are some crops that have 0 frost tolerance, right? In fact, basil can't even get below 50 degrees before starting to be damaged. It starts turning black at 50 degrees. So, but then, you know, tomatoes, cucumbers, melons, peppers, all those at about 32, they're going to keel over and die. Season's over. So if you want to grow those and have any of them for after, then obviously you got to have them grown before the first frost date, which is the 1st of October. And maybe you can pull some of those in and hold them. Bell peppers are a really good example where we're able to hold those oftentimes for 4 to 6 weeks even, if we get them in, get them cooled off and put them in the cooler. But then we got that next category, and this is sort of the frost tolerant, but not necessarily super hardy, right? So lettuce, celery, chard, broccoli, choy, beet tops, and radishes. And I'll get back to the beet tops. But all those things are things we can grow generally in high tunnels or other structures, but we can't put them out in the field under row cover. They're not going to thrive there. And they'll be pretty good for through October usually, and maybe even the first half of November. Usually by the second half of November, we've had some kind of frost to drop below 22, and we've had either serious damage to those or even just the loss of any of those crops. And then we get into the very hardy. the turnips, beets, carrots, scallions, leeks, kale, spinach. These are crops, some of these will go through the field, through the winter in the field without any problem. We frequently have spinach that overwinters in the field, sometimes under cover, sometimes we just, we're done with it and we leave it out there and it's still there in the spring when we go back. So, so these crops can be really hardy. The kings of these would be leeks and spinach. The ones that are on this list that are sort of edgy would be the carrots and beets. So carrots and beets bottoms are usually fine through pretty cold frost. We will usually put some row cover over them because just the top of the very top of the root may get damaged. The tops will die at around 15 degrees usually. So we don't expect to have healthy carrot tops or healthy beet tops after we get down below, somewhere around 20 to 15 degrees. We're going to have those go away. But we can still harvest the roots and still have them be useful. So oftentimes, like we saw, I don't know that you guys saw that, but we have carrots in the field right now that we'll harvest today, and they won't have tops that we can use, but the bottoms are beautiful. So we're still fine with that. So the seedling table though, right now it's a real hodgepodge because we've got tomatoes. These are our first, where are they? First tomatoes here. We got cherry tomatoes, black cherry, citrine, esterina, and then some big slicers. And these are the ones that are going to go into our big high tunnel in the middle of March. So these are kind of the very first warm weather crops we'll start. If you look around, there's probably also some bell peppers here and there. And then everything else is going to be cold hardy or somewhat hardy stuff like, for example, we got cosmos, which are a cool weather flower. We've got some kale that's popped up. We've got a bunch of head lettuce. And then we're also doing some production on this table. So we've got the pea shoots, which are really a pretty good seller this time of year. And they are on this time of year slows down a lot. In the summertime, there'll be a 10-day cycle from seed to harvest. This time of year, it's more like a 3-week cycle, which is a good indicator of how much things are slowing down right now. Even in a greenhouse, they just move that much slower. But that's, the pea shoots are a nice example of something that you can turn around in a really quick cycle and kind of keep production going through the winter with a fairly small footprint. I mean, these trays over here are the mature ones that we'll harvest this week. And those trays, each of those will be, around $25 worth of pea shoots. And so, that's a pretty good income out of a very small footprint. It does come with a pretty good and pretty big investment in seed, but it's relatively cheap seed. So I mean, it's a lot of seed, but it's fairly cheap. So I think we got about $5 worth of seed invested on each of those trays. That's not too bad. So this whitish stuff here is vermiculite, which is an expanded mica, similar to perlite, and that's what the white stuff in the blocks is perlite. But the vermiculite is just it's a mica that's been run through a furnace and it puffs it up. Its purpose here is to give the seeds just a little cover to keep the moisture even on them. We used to not do it at all, and we had some problems. I don't know, maybe 1 out of 10 seeds would not find the way up. It would like circle in the block before it just quit. And I asked a soil scientist what was going on there, and he said, "Oh, you just need to cover the seeds." And you can cover them with compost or soil, and that's fine. The vermiculite is less of a host for fungus, and so you get less damp off using vermiculite than you would with compost or soil. So compost or soil is a pretty decent substitute, but when we have the vermiculite, we use it. So this is a heated table, yeah. It's circulating warm water through there. It's not real hot right now, but it's because they were just using the wood furnace to warm it. But it's about 70-degree water circulating here. And when we really want to crank the heat up, which we'll probably start doing next week, we'll use that the on-demand water heater there next to Liz. That's mounted to the wall. It's a propane water heater. And that'll crank the water temperature up to about 120. And that'll get our soil temperatures up in the 70s. And it really makes a huge difference.
How does that circulate through here?
It's got a circulator pump over here at Justin's feet that is attached to a really fancy insulated reservoir, also known as an igloo cooler. And it's plumbed so that it pulls water out of the cooler, runs it through the wood furnace, runs it through the heater, and then across the seedling table and back into the reservoir. And it's a really great system. We love our heated table. It actually came with the greenhouse. I mean, that tells you something about the longevity of it. And when I first got here, I didn't really understand the need for it. And so for years operated without it, and then eventually visited some other farms that had heated seedling tables and was like, wow, your seedlings look really good. And they're like, yeah, that's because we use a heated seedling table. I said, right, I've got one of those. I'll try that out. So we have a germ chamber as well for those really temperature sensitives. But yeah, like all of our broccoli and kale and stuff like that can come out here. Once we get the heat cranked up, it'll still pop in 4 days on this germination chamber. What it also allows us to do is keep a really nice microclimate. You know, just the few inches above the soil and a few inches above it stays, say, 60 instead of 40 like the rest of the greenhouse. And that makes a huge difference in our growth rates. So I bring in a 100-pound propane tank and I run that, and it usually lasts me 4 to 5 days, depends on how much we run it. We've got a thermostat now. It's kind of one of those fancy refinements. But if it's a warm, you know, if it's a fairly warm series of days, the propane tank may last 10 days. If we get cold nights like last night, it's going to run most of the night to keep it warm. And then we're burning, somewhere around a 100-pound tank. We'll probably burn 15 pounds of it overnight on a night like last night. So I'm not a big fan of burning propane to heat things from an energy and fossil fuel use perspective, but our use versus how much food we're producing with it seems to me like a reasonable trade-off. Because without it, we're either waiting a long time to start our seedlings and then having much later crops, or we're cranking out a whole lot of wood heat. And that means getting up in the middle of the night twice and feeding the wood furnace. And I did that for the first several years, and then I got a propane heater. I was like, this is worth it. I like this plan. So that's what I do now. This overhead watering supplies about 70 to 90% of the water we want, depending on the heat and the humidity, and then we hand water the rest. What that does is it kind of gives a stopgap measure so we don't kill lots of plants, but it also doesn't overwater, which is real damaging to seedlings. So what this has done is it means that now, rather than having to check the seedlings 3 times a day, I just have to check them once a day. So it's a big refinement. And automated water, automated ventilation, automated heat, the big 3 of healthy seedlings. So, but yeah, we did, that video is actually pretty good, and it has it goes in more detail about how we monitor and automate those things.
Yeah. Like a YouTube channel you have?
A YouTube channel. I have a YouTube channel. Who knew? Yeah, Millsap Farm YouTube channel.
I think that's...
Pest and disease with seedlings, the things that we've dealt with, of course, aphids are always a problem in a spring greenhouse. And that's a tough one. The beneficials, here in another month, we'll order a bunch of beneficials, and that makes a huge difference. But this time of year, it's just too cold. They won't be that, they don't stay active enough to be useful. So this time of year, it's more about monitoring, trying to pull, if we get an infestation, trying to pull those trays and get them out of the way before they spread to the rest of the greenhouse. And then rodents were the other big one that we used to get. And if you look at the legs of our seedling table, they are wrapped in aluminum flashing. And that little nuance, this is one of those like $1,000 tricks that cost you $5 to do, right? I mean, it didn't cost us anything because we had the flashing in the barn. But they little boogers can't crawl it. I mean, they can't climb it. They get there and they're like, I can't. Little rodents, little mice and stuff. Because we used to find mice, you know, camped out in the seedling trays, and I mean, they love sunflowers, but they're not too picky. They'll eat anything. I mean, we had whole trays of peppers mowed off. And this is that whole 50% overage thing, you know, back when in the day when we didn't have that figured out, it was not uncommon for us to come in and find a whole tray just mowed to the ground. I mean, you lose 50.
Got other floor to table like connections.
Some, yeah. Every once in a while, one finds its way up to the table, but not much. That was the big one. They used to just scamper all over it. We also do a little more for rodent control in the greenhouse than we used to. We set more traps, basically. I don't use any of the pesticides that would, I mean, even the stuff that is supposedly food safe and all that, when I read up on it, what happens is those mice eat that and then they stagger out into the open and raptors eat them. And it's a major source of raptor poisoning, so owls and hawks and eagles. I don't want to be that guy, so I just leave that stuff out. But we do a lot of trapping. I have the live catch traps, I have the snap traps, I mean, there's a snap trap right here on the table. So we are pretty diligent about rodent trapping because they can wipe you out in a hurry. But those are the two biggies. Otherwise, most of the other things are not a real big issue at this stage in the game. So these fans run 24/7. Unless we got the sides up on a breezy day, we'll turn them off. But we generally run the circulation fans run all the time. And that's a big part of keeping disease in control on the seedling table is keeping good airflow and letting things dry out just enough to kill off those fungus and bacteria that would alight on the surface. So like this, I'm looking at this table right now, and it's a nice moisture level. It's good and sunny today. I'd like to let it dry out for another hour or so, and then I'll come through and water a little bit. But that hour-long dry out is just enough to knock the fungus down and knock the bacteria down. The seedling heat really helps with that too. It gives us a more rapid cycling on on drying out the soil. In fact, when I come in here and water, when the seedling heat's running at the full temperature, 120 degrees, and I come through and water, there'll be this like cloud of fog that follows me as I water down the table, which is kind of makes me feel magical. I like that. So I've got this little guy right here. Yep, just like that. And it's, a water head is a big key. So the red heads are the 1,000 hole per head. And if they're not clogged, you can't, it's really hard to wash a plant out with one of these as long as you're not being foolish. Yeah, whereas the other heads are all more coarse than the red heads, and they will wash stuff out pretty easily. So these are nice. This, yeah, you want to see it's right? It's pretty satisfying. So this, and the motion I'm doing, you're right, I'm not wanting to saturate anything unless I really do. If I've got a really well-established plant like this milkweed over here that's drying out, then I will saturate it. But in general, I'm just giving everything a real light rain, and especially being sensitive to where I've got stuff that's just seeds, because I don't want to wash them out. So I'll move back and forth. But the other thing that people often don't do when they water, you really need to give stuff a lot of water, more than most people realize. So the thing to check on that, when I'm watering seedlings, I'll lift a couple trays, and I can tell by lifting these violas are a little dry.
By the weight of it?
By the weight, exactly. And it's just an experience thing, over time you just lift enough trays, you go, oh, that's dry. The other thing that I'll do when I'm not necessarily on seedling tables, but if I'm doing pots or things like that, just stick your hand in it, stick your finger down in the soil. Because it's really often the case that if it starts dry and you water it, you get that first ½ inch real nice and wet, but it's still bone dry down below that. And especially with peat-based soil mixes, which almost all the potting mixes are going to have some level of peat in them. Peat hangs on to water really well, but as soon as it dries out, it's now hydrophobic, and it will not absorb water easily. So you really have to water again and again and again to get caught back up if you have some peat that gets dried out. And that's true even of a lot of compost will get hydrophobic if it gets too dry. Yeah, but watering is a big deal, and in fact, it's a running joke among market farmers, but it's like, how do you teach watering? Because it's really a hard thing, and it doesn't look like a hard thing. So people think they've got it as soon as they go run a water wand, and then they overwater or underwater or wash things out or whatever, and it's just something you have to be, you got to do it and pay attention enough times that you go, now I'm starting to get it. Like I see what I'm doing, I understand how much water I need to apply. And part of that's watching how much is running off, part of it's testing the soil, part of it's lifting trays, but it's all this like constant checking and back checking yourself to see what you're actually achieving versus what you think you're doing. So. I'm using Dairy Dew now. We started out doing all our own, soil mixes with just following kind of a typical compost and peat and perlite and some minerals. And then a couple years back, we decided that we really needed a pre-mixed system, because what we were finding was we would often have trays that just were really inconsistent because they weren't mixed properly. And you know, whether that was my fault or my help's fault or the kid's fault, it didn't really matter, right? It's like, well, this is not working. So now we have one mix. We know what we're doing with that. We actually have two mixes. We have one that goes in the big blocks and one that and in pots, and one that goes in small starter. And that's the only distinction people have to make. And both of them do a really good job of growing good plants. So the only difference is the stuff that goes in the real small ones is much finer and a little less nutrients. So the bigger stuff that's going to be in the blocks longer, you know, like the tomatoes, for example, they're going to be in those blocks for 6 weeks before we pot them up. Those get in a more coarse, higher nutrient potting mix. So on the older potting soil, there's two things that are going to come up. One is it's going to be really dry, and that is, it's got enough peat in it that stuff's a huge pain to wet. So you can do that a couple different things. One is just every time you walk by it, spray it, and that will really make a big difference over time. You can't just like set the hose in there and let it run. It will float the whole pile away. I've tried it, speaking from experience. You can crack a hose and let it just trickle in there. That's not a bad thing to do at all. Like, do it overnight, just let it will soak up its volume in water. It's amazing. It will soak up so much water. And that will really make a big difference. The other thing is, because it's so dry, and I run into the same thing, it makes the biology go dormant, which means your nutrients are not so available because it is an organic nutrient source. So if it's something that you know, like head lettuce, that it really needs to get off to a strong start, you might consider adding some extra nutrients to it. You're not really going to hurt anything by doing that usually, as long as you don't get carried away. The rule of thumb is 15 pounds of base fertilizer per cubic yard. That's pretty big measurements. The other way to think of that is a wheelbarrow needs about 3 cups of a sort of general organic amendment. So when I say general organic amendment, it would be something like a blood meal, green sand, rock phosphorus blend, equal parts, or anything that's going to give you basically a even nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium. But anything like that, it's going to be about 3 cups into a wheelbarrow load. But it's worth doing, because otherwise you'll be really frustrated and those seedlings will just stare back at you. Now eventually, as the biology kicks back in, then all those nutrients that are in that mix will become more available. But as it's so dry right now, it just takes a while for all those microbes to kind of kick back in and do their job. I mean, we bring them in and set them here over by a seedling table, and every time I walk by, I'll just shoot it with a little water. I do bring the whole sling in, because otherwise it gets frozen this time of year, and that's really not nice. Frozen soil is worse than dry soil. You can't put that in a pot. Like, it's an ice cube, 3 by 3 by 4. But yeah, we do. So we bring them in, and I also like having it warmed up, because when you put stuff into cold soil, now you got to warm the soil to get it to start germinating. And the other real key with that is when you finish making soil blocks, or not soil blocks so much, but if you're using insert trays, setting them into a tray to soak, make sure they get really wet. You know, and usually what we can do is we can set them in a tray, and then while we're making the next tray and seeding it, that will soak up enough water that, you know, it's kind of saturated, and then we move that onto the germination chamber or seedling table. Predominantly, it's a composted dairy mix, dairy manure, but it does have some peat in there as well. And we've been really happy with it. It's been a good mix for us. I will say that I think I ran into that last year with an older bag of germ mix, that the 101, that I should have been adding nutrients to, and we didn't. And we had some fall seedlings that were just not very good. So I won't repeat that mistake. So we'll do this in reverse then. The most protective space is my greenhouse, right? We can add heat here. It's double layer, so it's really insulated. Yeah, just go on out the back there, Justin. And it's enough structure that we don't worry about the snow load. It's kind of the Cadillac of winter growing spaces. So the big structural greenhouse, you know, advantages to that. We can easily add heat. It's a permanent structure. It's got electricity, it's got water. So it's the easiest way to grow in terms of just having really good results all the time, every time, right? At the same time, it's a very expensive structure. I mean, $20 a square foot is the kind of the starting point for a big structural greenhouse. So this is a $120,000 greenhouse. We would not build this greenhouse again if we were starting from scratch. Like I said, the value was already gone because it had been used for so long. That was a big advantage to us, that we got to kind of step in and benefit from the previous farmer's investment. The next level down would be an unheated high tunnel, right? So our fig house here is a great example of the unheated high tunnel structure. And these are just simple pipe structures. We bent this one on farm. I've bought lots of kits as well and assembled them. But the key elements are, we got a single layer of plastic. Sometimes it'll be a double layer with air blown between for a little more structure and insulation. But it's a simple pipe structure. And the temperatures at night in here will not be very much different than the outside temperatures. So that's important to remember. You're still going to get a cold, hard frost in here, but you get high daytime temperatures, and so you get a lot of growth. So what we can do for protection, we can cover crops at night with row covers under there, but then we can also pull them off in the daytime and get lots of quick growth in things like lettuce and spinach and so on that we wouldn't get outside because it would never reach that temperature. So it's kind of a middle ground, right, between field production and the greenhouse. We're not adding a lot of supplemental heat. Now in the springtime, we do plant our tomatoes, peppers, eggplant out a lot earlier than the frost-free time. So we're putting them in the tunnels, and then we're providing a very small amount of heat. So we'll put like a big propane torpedo heater in there, and we'll set it on a thermostat at like 38 degrees. And that way we can keep from freezing our tomato plants to death and get that month of earliness that we'd like to have, but we're also only investing, maybe $100 per tunnel in the propane for the spring. So that's a pretty reasonable, to me that's a real reasonable spend. Like that's less than I'm spending on the plants by a long shot. So definitely worth that $100 worth of propane. And to be fair too, like that's not every year even. I mean, some years we run the heater one night. It cost me 20 bucks. Last year we had this persistent cold. It was not real cold, but it was just every night it was getting in the 25 or so for about 2 weeks. We ran the heaters every night. So that year was probably more like $200 or $300 per tunnel worth of propane. Still well worth it though. I mean, that early tomatoes, that's, the first harvest more than triples that return. We're going to get a lot of tomatoes off of there. So that's a high tunnel. Now over here we have what we call our kitten tunnels. And the reason we have kitten tunnels is because we have these other tunnels that are sort of like real simple high tunnels that we call our caterpillar tunnels, which became, Cat 1 and Cat 2. And the baby versions of the caterpillar tunnels are obviously baby cats or kittens. So we also call them tiny tunnels. We bend these on farm. These are really simple. The biggest advantage to these tunnels is they're super low cost. So this whole tunnel I think costs us about $1,500 or so. And that's because we built it ourselves and because the materials are cheap and so on. And it's off the shelf material. It's just chain link fence top rail. So we bend that and we build these structures. In here we're able to grow those real cold hardy things like kale and spinach, some of the cold hardy flowers. They can be overwintered in here. We're not going to get as much growth as we would in a high tunnel, but we also have a lot less cost. So it's this trade-off. And it does allow us to do things like early snapdragons where we just couldn't do those in the field, but they don't really justify space necessarily in the high tunnel. Or it also gives us a little bit of a succession ability. So our very earliest snapdragons can be in the big heated greenhouse. The next snapdragons will come out of the high tunnels, and then the last tunneled snapdragons will come out of the kittens. And they'll stage themselves naturally. Even if we plant them on the same date, they will basically stagger themselves out that way because they've got a little less heat in each structure. And then the final version of protection in the field, we'll walk this way, is just row cover in the field. And this year all we've done is row cover. Some years we'll even drag plastic over crops if we have something that's going to get really cold. For example, the times we usually end up doing that would be like a really hard frost in early November. If it was going to cause damage to our cabbages or maybe our beet tops or things like that, then we may go ahead and not just put row cover but actually pull greenhouse plastic over the top. When we lay row cover on top of crops, we've got two options. One is to just go directly on top of the crop, and that's what we're going to do 90% of the time in the fall. We rarely would do anything different than that, so we'll just pull out a big sheet of row cover, we'll drape it over the whole thing, we'll anchor it down with sandbags or even scoops of soil. I mean, we just bury the edges sometimes. My crew doesn't like it when we bury edges because later it turns into a real mess, but it is real quick and easy when you go out to do something. It's going to be a lot colder that night than you thought it was going to be, and so you're out there at 3 o'clock in the afternoon as the temperature drops and you're just trying to get the row cover spread. It's a really good time to use shovels full of soil instead of sandbags. But if you're doing it long term where you're going to move it, pull it on and off and harvest under it, sandbags are a much better option. But this is the next version of that, which is hooping over the top of the crop before you put the cover on. And what this does is this helps prevent frost damage where the cover touches the leaf. So this is spinach, for example, and what we find is if we don't hoop the spinach, then we end up with little points where the frost cover, the row cover, touched the spinach and caused them to lose their color with frost damage. So this is a nice middle ground where we're still getting some of the benefit of even like a little bit of a hoop house, but it's field and it's cheap. Those hoops are really cheap. Downside is, as you can see, they never hold up. Row covers are just not a permanent solution to protecting anything. They are at best a couple of months of protection, and then they start looking like Swiss cheese like this one behind us, and it's at some point you go, I'm kind of tired of playing with Swiss cheese in the field, and that's how we've ended up with 26,000 square feet of covered space instead of more acres of row cover, but row cover is great because you can pull it out, you can protect things temporarily, you can protect things, at kind of the end of their season, and then we can pull them out early in the spring as well and get things, if we put out early brassicas, which are frost hardy, but if we want them to grow the best, we're going to keep them under row cover because it's going to protect them from the coldest nights and the strongest winds and those kinds of things. So. These are these little 9-gauge wire hoops. So, well, they're pre-cut. I actually buy these pre-cut. We have cut them. These are from Morgan County Seed. We used to use EMT, bent 3/4 metal EMT as big hoops. And it's a 10-foot piece of pipe. You put a 6 to 8 inches into the ground on either side. So now you still got to have a 10-foot piece of row cover to cover that. And even then it's kind of, you really got to stick them in if you want to use a 10-foot piece. You need a 12-foot piece. And there are advantages to that. You can sometimes cover 2 beds with them, which is nice. The downside was they stick that much higher up into the wind and they caught that much more wind, and so I don't think they held up even as well as these do. So I love row cover in a tunnel. It just changes the atmosphere so much. The only thing you got to watch is moisture levels, And the rule of thumb there is if you've got wet row cover, your tunnel is too wet. So you need to ventilate more. And that mystified me for years because I always had wet row cover. And then I met Paul and Sandy Arnold, who are probably the best winter growers I know and do lots and lots of this up in New York. And then also the Whitegers, Paul and Allison Whiteger. And both of them said, yeah, if your row covers are wet in the morning, when you go to pull row covers off, you're running your greenhouse too wet in the wintertime, which means you got to run a really dry tunnel in the wintertime. And that means lots of ventilation. And it means being really picky about when you water, making sure you water on a real sunny day, that you can leave it open to vent for several hours. Because you want the surface of the soil never to be wet. And the thing that makes the row cover wet is both condensation of soil coming up, moisture coming up from the soil, but then also that condensation on the roof. And that also makes a huge impact on how quickly things grow and how well they do, because if it's raining for the first 3 hours of the morning off the plastic, then 1, you're not getting very good sunlight intensity, and 2, you're getting constant moist foliage, which means lots of fungal and bacterial problems. So it really pays to keep the greenhouse dry as much as you can. Now, there's times, we live in a challenging climate for this because we do get hot, cold. We got, that's not really warm today, but 50, and with a nighttime low of 26. It was actually 19 out here last night. And then, over the weekend it's going to be below freezing, and then who knows, but in 2 weeks it'll probably be 75 because that's how it works around here. So that makes it hard to keep things dry. and it does slow things down a little bit to keep them dry, but we have found overall the benefit is in running a drier tunnel, you get less moisture on everything, which leads to less disease, and you get those row covers are much easier to deal with when they're not wet too. So. Yeah, so watering frequency, ventilation. So anytime it's above 40 degrees, we want to open up our tunnels and let some air out if we can. We'd let that humidity out. Just think in your head, every time I open up a tunnel, I'm trying to dry this out, right? Open both ends, let the breeze blow through. And then the other thing that they do a lot of, and we've kind of gone back and forth on this, but a lot of those winter growers are using a fair bit of ground cover or even plastic mulch on the beds, because that will help hold the moisture in the soil. I really don't like using plastic in the tunnels. It's obnoxious, but it does work. You know, it's a strategy that will keep a lot more moisture in the soil than if you just let it all evaporate back out into the air. So this time of year especially, you would like to water at a time when the soil is going to be able to dry completely before you close up the tunnel. Whether that's whether that's realistic or not. But then, so we're always looking for days like now when it's going to be, so it's going to be 50 today with sunshine, so the tunnels are going to warm up really well, and then we're going to not be below freezing overnight, and then we're going to heat up again tomorrow and have this nice breeze going. So these will be really good days to water. So we'll do quite a bit of watering starting about now, so late morning. We'll try and get a bunch of watering done, and then we'll try and get everything opened up and let it ventilate all afternoon. And what we're trying to do basically is, we're trying to move the water past the surface and down into that subsurface, and then let that surface dry out. The only exception to that, of course, is if we're trying to germinate stuff. And so what we would try to do in that case is, if we know we need to plant, like we recently planted carrots and spinach in one of our big high tunnels, and we just went through the whole thing. We did 3 beds of carrots and 2 beds of spinach, and then we just overhead irrigated the whole thing for like 10 days straight. I mean, not on the whole time, but like we just let it be soaking wet that whole time. And then when they started popping up, we'd back off the water and say, okay, well now we've got to let it dry out a little bit. But that really is the only exception to trying to keep a dry tunnel, is when you're germinating, you can't keep a dry tunnel. And I should say, in winter growing, it's frequent for us to not water, even 2 or 3 weeks at a time to go without watering, especially with well-established crops. They just don't need, unless it's sunny, they really don't need it. So we just base it in, and we'll, it's that whole scoop up the soil in your hand test. I mean, that's as sophisticated as it gets, but it's absolutely the way to do it. I know people have soil moisture monitors in their tunnels and stuff, and I think that's great, but for me, it's better just to regularly walk the beds and make sure that we've got the moisture we want and the dryness that we want as well. Thanks for coming out, guys.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, you bet.